I can start the conversation with asking you to maybe, we have been talking here in Baku. One of the main topics is French colonialism and ongoing French colonialism in various parts of the world, including, of course, the Pacific that I know most about, but also other parts like the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. And what I'm interested in, you have a, to look into the deeper motivation of why maybe France has been quite obstinate and quite reluctant in letting their colonies go. Maybe in some way different from, for example, the British that have in most parts withdrawn from their colonial empire. And so maybe you can, with your background in international relations and also looking into like psychological dimensions of that, I would be interested in your take on maybe what's your analysis of why France has done a particular type of colonial policy.
It has been really interesting over the time. Yesterday, I was enlightened with a great many presentations. One of the common thread that kind of goes through in all presentations is the brutality of French colonialism. Of course, historically, Belgium is considered as the worst, but perhaps it has not been compared enough to the French yoke in many places. Now, this is a really interesting question because the French colonialism is not only archetypical, but also unique in its own ways, because being a nuclear power, nuclear colonial power, and using the colonies as its nuclear test bed in Polynesia, in Algeria, and elsewhere, the French colonialism created great damage, ecological damage in the former colonies. And this is something like waging wars and crimes against humanity, except that it is not just one-shot war, killing one generation, but it is killing and maiming and spreading diseases like cancer generations after generations up until today, after so many decades, 5-6 decades after, still these places are suffering great ecological disasters and tragedies. Now, going back to the origin of your question, of course, I'll leave the Marxist materialist foundations to you if you don't mind.
Sure.
This is really important that we always find a rationale that the colonist has some resources or geopolitical reasoning when they go and conquer the territories and the land on it. And actually, most of the time, let me just clarify one very important point, that when a colonist looks the world map, they see a property value. That is just places, properties. When the people look their places, they see home. So that is the main difference between the colonial gaze and the native populations. For the colonists, it is just a property value, use value in Marxist sense. Whereas for the people living on that land, that is their home, that is their homeland, fatherland, motherland. Now, when we look at to the brutality, the French brutality, there is material causes which we may return. But also I believe there's something in the French psyche that is coming from at least two traumas or two complexes. First is their inferiority complex vis-a-vis the British, that they were defeated and lingua franca became English and they never could get over it eventually. They were always the so-called second best in their colonial endeavor, following the British. And whereas the British were just good old capitalists and they conquered the land, they used it, abused it, exploited it, and when they didn't need it, they just throw it away. Whereas the French heavily invested, coming from a quasi-capitalist, corporatist understanding with colonies. States are always, governments are always involved with the colonial investment, so to speak. And I think that there is this French psyche that we need to also alternatively focus on, besides the material interests, without really forgetting the material foundations, just as a supplement. And this is what I mean by that. Now, the main problem with the French psyche is that they were defeated to the British, and during World War II, they were defeated to the Nazi Germany. And after the defeat, in the late 1940s, mid 1950s, when the colonial movement started, the colonies, the former British colonies, Ghana, India, others, Cyprus, started to declare their independence, the French put tremendous resistance in Vietnam, in Algeria, and elsewhere. And one wonders why the French couldn't get rid of these colonies. Materially speaking, they were dependent on the sources. They still are dependent on the sources in Niger and in other places. But at the same time, there's an extreme brutality committed by the French colonial forces. And there's kind of atrocities, and they're kind of sexual atrocities. And one wonders why these kind of things happen. And I think that the French could never really get over with their own defeat in the hands of the British or the German, that created great trauma, which projected on the colonized people as great violence against humanity.
Thank you very much. I think that totally makes sense. On the other hand, I mean, I also want to make sure that we don't want to, just only denounce France here, because we did have also some very acts of very much brutality in British colonial history as well. If you look at the way the Australian Aborigines, for example, were being decimated, exposed to genocide, and then even though generally, of course, Britain was more easy to give away colonial freedom to the colonies, but there were also some cases in Kenya, for example, where the Mau Mau resistance was also treated in a very similar brutal way, with camps and tortures and all those kind of things. So there was instances of that brutality as well, but you're definitely right that there is something about this particularly, I mean, this is kind of fighting to the very last, even in cases where it was kind of futile. That in Vietnam or in Algeria, it was kind of it couldn't work to keep these places French after the majority of the local people, those who knew the ground, those who knew the forests, that they were all up in arms. Like it's impossible. The British realized that in Kenya, after a relatively short time, right? But so I think you are definitely up to a very good point here. I also would kind of compare that to the Germans, who were latecomers, who were like even more of a latecomer in the colonial period, and in as maybe it's known that the Germans did that horrible colonial genocide in Namibia in among the Herero, and that maybe in the same way, this inferior complex, they have to compete against both the British and the French, and now they are particularly brutal in trying to keep their part of the colonial world at that time. Of course, then history was different through World War I and everything. But anyway, to come back to this question about the French, and I know you mentioned more like a historical materialist point of view, it is definitely true that the British were always more they were more in the mainstream of liberal capitalism, and would not essentially not interfere into a liberal capitalist economy just for national prestige, not the same way that the French did, when much of the French colonial enterprise was actually not it was not kind of a rational decision based on market principles, but they would actually pour money, state money, into establishing colonies and then in keeping colonies, even though economically there was nothing really coming out for them. So there is certainly a more of a kind of a state capitalism or a state intervention in the economic process for reasons of national prestige and of kind of, again, overcoming the inferiority complex. So in that sense, I would think that the materialist analysis and the psychoanalytical analysis really kind of go hand in hand in various ways.
That's absolutely right, because I think that one should never forget the what happened in China, not only during the two opium wars that the British
Yes.
waged against the Chinese, but also the collective European effort to put down the Boxer rebellion
yes.
in China
Of course.
in that regard. So there is an idea, and that kind of gives me another idea that I would like to discuss with you. That is, now when we look at, for instance, things like the Great War, the First World War,
Yes.
of course it was neither a world war, it was a European war, nor was it a great war, it was a greed war that the late comers in colonial race
Yes.
and the scramble of Africa, they wanted more,
Yes.
bigger shares, which kind of gave the structure. I know the Western history teaching is that one Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, that triggered the World War. But anyone who read glimpse of E.H. Carr would immediately say that this is ridiculous. We need to look at the structural conditions that triggered the war.
Of course.
And the structural conditions were, of course, nothing but the colonial interest, the colonial race. But we never call the world experience with its proper names. We always use the Western gaze and Western naming. For instance, the First World War. Perhaps the first real world war, the genocidal war, was waged by the colonial forces against the natives. Sure. So the first great war was the war against the First Nations all over the world. So
absolutely.
That is another point that I just wanted to raise.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean that brings us maybe a little forward to looking at the present and at the future. And I mean, I think in the last couple decades we've seen tremendous changes in the way the world has been shaped, and the world has been dominated by different powers. At the same time, we see also what do you call it, a continuity of colonialism and of colonial attitudes, of colonial, not just the remaining colonies such as French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and others, Guam, and so on and so forth, but we see kind of an increasing contradiction in a way of a prevalence of colonial attitudes and views on one hand, but on the same time we get a kind of a change on the ground in the way in which Western countries are less and less dominant, and emerging powers or coming up and trying to reshape the world. So I don't know, have you any thoughts that you would have on how these things kind of go together, the kind of struggle of small countries, of post-colonial nations and colonies in struggle at the same time the kind of shifts in global politics?
Oh, thank you very much. I think that this is a question of, one way or another, emerging multipolarity. And first of all, we need to distinguish the liminal period of polarization, because this is the process. What we are in right now is the polarization process, that is multipolarization. It is not settled yet. It is in the making. We do not know how many poles that is going to be emerging. We know that this is interregnum, that is the end of the old is dead. The unipolar American hegemony is gone. Even Trump is now acknowledging it. But the new did not emerge yet.
Sure.
So this is kind of the liminal period, somewhere in between. So we do not know how many big powers. We expect at least 3, but perhaps one should add European Union as a distinct group. Maybe India is going to be emerging. BRICS kind of alternatively emerging. So then the question emerges, how would these former colonies, colonized nations, gained their independence not as the initial members of the United Nations, but they were admitted to the United Nations later.
Yes.
With that kind of a categorical distinction, how would they survive first to the polarization, then perhaps to the multipolarity? I think that that is the idea that we should ponder about, we should focus on. And my humble take on it, that it is going to be more difficult to survive in multipolarity because size is going to be something that matters increasingly. China is 1.5 billion. India is reaching almost 2. Now it's the most populous country in the world. Europeans together reach certain threshold. Russia, United States, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia. But I think that the colonial movement should, the post-colonial movement rather, should think about how to create a pan movement among themselves to ensure their survivability or fitness to the changing environment. And when we talk about the pan movement, of course, this is your area of specialty. So,
sure, absolutely. And I mean, I think one thing that I've been thinking about, and that you have been thinking about as well in our previous conversations, that that I think it's important that we gain kind of a more like a positive consciousness about that, or that those post-colonial countries gain more of a positive connotation, because we had that non-aligned movement, and that was already trying to do something like that, right? During the
original name, as you suggested.
But yeah, exactly, and that's that exactly. It was later. It was named the non-aligned movement, which is, I think, problematic because it has this negativity in its word. Right? It's a non. It doesn't say what it is. It only says what it is not. It's not aligned to the Soviet Union or to the US. But the initial name, when they had the Bandung Conference in 1953, was the Afro-Asian movement, right? So they tried to combine the Pan-Africanist sentiment with the Pan-Asianist sentiment and try to create something that would cover the entire global South. They didn't use the term yet at the time, but those who were not part of the either Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. So I think it would be an interesting vision to see how we can kind of maybe reinvigorate this idea, and not of necessarily the non-alignment, but more of the kind of a pan movement that would kind of collectivize these post-colonial countries, and of course, also which would then include solidarity and strong solidarity for the places that are still colonized, and to get rid of their colonizers, by kind of reinvigorating such a kind of pan idea of pan. I mean, we have Pan-Africanism and we have Pan-Asianism. Well, maybe not as much anymore now, with like China and Japan and different countries all pulling into different directions, which is somewhat unfortunate, I think. But it's something like the Pan-Africanism, which I think is still very much alive, and has now being reinvigorated through these revolutionary governments in the Sahel, in Niger, or Niger in French, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, and of course many other similar movements in Africa. So, I mean, maybe something can be built, like if that kind of Pan-Africanist sentiment that is very strong, if that can somehow kind of extend to other parts of the globe. I mean, in my region, of course, I'm a specialist in the history of Pan-Pacific sentiment, or Pan-Oceanianism, as I labeled it. Still not a very well-established term, but I use it in my own publications. If there's kind of some kind of, I think, if there could be some kind of federation of those Pan movements, especially if they gather multiple smaller nations that are not likely to become one of those poles, but will still obviously need a chance to survive. That, I think, is the way to go more into this kind of regional consciousness, but then also not have each of these regions just see itself in isolation, but see kind of these as maybe, again, collective poles. Maybe in the way that the European Union is one pole, even though there's not necessarily one country fully dominant. I mean, there's somewhat dominating, Germany, but it's still like not fully dominated. It's meant to be a regionalism, and if that same same idea could be developed in a much stronger way in both Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Oceania as well. So that probably could be one way of how things could develop in a positive way in this process that we are witnessing.
If I may, I think that we can even add something like pan-islandism, because a lot of islands, Caribbeans, West Indies, East Indies, Oceania, there are a lot of island states that are relatively small in their geographical size, area, and population. Nevertheless, they share a very common history, that they were colonized and they suffered in the hands of the colonizer. So they have a lot of people brought as slaves from Africa. So there's kind of an Africa connection.
Oh, of course, yes.
All over these islands, states.
Well, not in the Pacific, though, but
not in the Pacific, but in the Caribbean.
Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, for sure.
Indian Ocean and the Caribbean.
Yes.
But there's kind of a shared history in a very twisted and almost reversed way. But they do share a lot of commonalities, and definitely they share a common interest in the newly emerging multipolar world, which kind of brings another question in my mind, that the United Nations, the subject of United Nations, which is in a way for the colonized world the necessary evil, and the foundation of United Nations was kind of the balance of two necessities. One is the superpower balance of power between the superpowers, namely then US and USSR. Now, the second part is the General Assembly. Now, with the decolonization movement, the General Assembly enlarged. What would be the role of the United Nations in the multipolar world as far as the formerly colonized world is concerned?
Well, I mean, I think that is, in a way, one of the most crucial questions in this process of multipolarization that we are witnessing, is that we actually have, there have been some unfortunate, I think, this comparisons of the emerging multipolar world with the so-called concert of nations of the 19th century, post the Congress of Vienna. And especially some of the American conservative, like the Huntingtonian school, they have always put that out. And I think the fundamental mistake in that analysis is that when the Congress of Vienna founded that kind of foundation of the 19th century, great power concert, there was no previously well-regulated international system covering the entire world like we have now with the United Nations. Right?
Or the colonization in this, like the colonial history.
And the same thing, the colonization was, I mean, there was colonization, there was especially that horrible slave trade episodes were already well in existence, right? But the colonial empires did not cover yet, the majority of the world's surface was not yet under the control of Western powers in 1815. It only became essentially full-scale control over every single square meter by about 1900. And then even then there were pockets, obviously, where it wasn't actually the case on the ground. But anyway, so yeah, sure. I mean, definitely the post-colonial or still colonial heritage that we have is one element, and the United Nations that provides a relatively strong, at least never seen before in history, level of rules on the international level. So that is but of course, as you say, these rules are still relatively weak and are of course meant to particularly protect the strong five powers who founded the UN and have that veto power in the Security Council. So I think that is becoming more and more of an issue, that the Security Council does not reflect the reality of powers in the world today. The fact that countries like France and the United Kingdom, that have less than 1% of the population now, have 20% of the veto power in the world each. That is quite it's just an imbalance that I think is not sustainable in the long run. So I think the sooner or later, and whether they want it or not, the United Nations needs to be reformed, and the Security Council needs to be reformed, because if that does not happen, we will have more and more unilateral actions, and things like the United States has already done in the 90s and 2000s, and then Russia is currently pretty much doing their own, creating their own security environment according to their own wishes, and not and just ignoring the Security Council, right? The U.S. started it, and Russia is doing it now. So these are not good things, and the only way of preventing that from becoming the norm, that every large power will just do whatever it wants, will be to reform the Security Council. So to me, would be the first step that needs to be done to make the UN to continue having the UN as a meaningful international organization or in the international framework to kind of accompany and to kind of regulate this process of multipolar polarization.
And therefore, just in a concluding remark, it's well said. So, if United Nations to survive, there is a necessity to reform it
Yes.
with the facts on the ground, and whether it survives it or not, maybe it's the demise. The multipolarity would be the demise of the United Nations, as the 30s gave demise to the League of Nations.
Yes.
That changing systemic polarity always shifts the international order and organizations, and then the pan movement should get ready for its own alternative organizations and institutions to ensure, or at least increase their survivability.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree. And I guess if I may add the last comment to that, I also think that if we look back into where we are here now, and what could be the role of Azerbaijan and what could be the role of the Baku Initiative Group, is to help promote such a kind of a smooth transition, right? As Azerbaijan being a middle power, being not extremely powerless, but also not being one of the biggest world powers. And of course, Azerbaijan is just one example, but countries kind of in that position that are like not really part of a bloc, and but has a still have some strength in the concert of nations. If it would be in their best interest to do exactly what you are saying, to try to kind of push for the reform of the UN to keep it relevant.
Well, I think that this is very important and brilliant. We should, though, see that the current leadership, the power of His Excellency President Ilham Aliyev, exceeds in many ways that the global distribution of power attributed to Azerbaijan, which can be compared in the past during the Bandung Conference, during the PAN movements, earlier PAN movements. The comparison would be people like Nehru, Tito, or Makarios, that they were of a Nasser that comes to mind. So
absolutely.
Right now, the president's power, the leadership skills in strategic environment far exceeds that is the power that is being attributed otherwise to the mid to small power status to Azerbaijan.
Sure. I would agree.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.